So James, I have your presentation on my computer, and you can
Okay.
just tell me when you want me to change slides.
Okay, well, please change that one. I'm tired of looking at myself.
All
All right, well, welcome everyone. So I call this little talk The Secret Life of Bees. But as you know, as master gardeners, everything that we discuss is scientifically based, backed information. So it's not really that secret, but I kind of like that name because I think a lot of it, when I learned about it, was new and interesting to me, and I hope it'll be interesting to all of you as well. I am a beekeeper. I don't know if you guys have the thumbs up, or how many in this class are beekeepers aside from myself in your class. Just hit me on chat if you're a beekeeper. It'd be interesting to know how many people are beekeepers. This is not going to be about beekeeping, but we will talk a lot about honeybees because we sort of have the most intimate relationship with them as human beings. And a lot of the studies that I quote are about the effects of what's going on in the world on honeybees. So next slide.
Next slide.
So I thought just tell you a little bit about a bee's anatomy, because as lovely as they are, probably not a lot of us get to spend time up close and personal with them. So bees, like all insects, have 3 body parts, and we're looking specifically at the honeybee, but it's very typical body structure for all bees. For the head of the bee has pretty much all its sensory organs. What's kind of cool is you've probably seen it has those 2 big eyes on the side, and those are something called compound eyes. And what they are is there are all these different facets that sort of take a little snapshot of a bigger picture, and then it knits it together in its brain, and that's how it sees in the context of how we think of seeing. And the benefit of the compound eye is it's much better equipped to detect motion than our kinds of eyes, the kind that you and I have. A bee also has 3 little eyes called ocelli, and they're very hard to see with your own eyes, but they're on the top of the head. And these ocelli are what we call simple eyes, and they don't see pictures at all, but they detect changes in light. And so they use them for all different kinds of things, including kind of staying steady when they're flying. A bee has a long kind of a tongue that's a bit different from ours. It's more like a straw, and it's hairy, and they use that for sipping nectar out of the glands. And then probably the most important sensory organ on a bee, and on a lot of insects, is actually their antenna. This is where the bees will get their senses of touch, of taste, smell, and even a kind of a unique form of hearing. So then we go down to the thorax, which is that middle segment of the body, and that basically has the appendages they use for locomotion, for moving around. They have, these sets of wings that can get them moving as fast as 15 miles per hour. And they also have these legs. And I just wanted to point out this kind of interesting thing that honeybees have on their legs. If you see in the front foreleg, there's something called an antenna cleaner. And as I told you, they get a lot of their sensory input from their antennas, and the antennas get dusty and covered in pollen. So they use these cleaners to sort of clean their antenna, and you've maybe seen even other insects doing that as well. They also have these rakes and combs on their legs that you don't see in this drawing, but they're there, and they use them to get the pollen off of their body. And then they have something on the back called a pollen press. And the pollen press is basically like a little packer. They move the pollen into that pollen press, and then they compress it down. And then they move it into something called their corbicula, or the pollen basket. And it's not on this drawing, but if you look over at my picture, you'll see there's a yellow kind of bulb on the side of the honeybee that's on that flower. And that's all pollen that's been packed into its corbicula, or its pollen basket. So that's the next slide now. So I became a beekeeper as a favor for some friends who were living down in LA, and they bought a big ranch up in Sonoma, and they planted 2,200 olive trees. And my friend said, "Oh my gosh, I never see any bees on this property. We need bees. Well, could you possibly learn how to take care of bees And then when I move up there, I'll take over for you. So I started going to these beekeeping classes and found a mentor. And a couple weeks into it, my friend said, never mind. He said, you know, it turns out olive trees are wind pollinated, so I don't really need to have all these beehives. But I was already really hooked and really interested in bees. So when I set up my first hive, I set it up on my own, in my own garden in Marin County where I live. And I noticed a peculiar thing, which was that I had all these bees in my garden, but none of them were like landing on anything in my garden. They were all outside down the road on the rosemary bushes or on the echium bushes on the corner. But my garden was just full of beautiful leaves and really no flowers. And of course, that is pretty obvious to all of us because bees need flowers. And of course, flowers need bees. And when we look at flowers and we look at their colors and their scents and their designs, we think they're, you know, so beautiful for us, but they're really just about attracting pollinators, mostly bees, but also moths and birds pollinate flowers. And so a lot of these flowers have evolved over time in a way that makes it easy for a pollinator to visit them. And one of the ways they've evolved is they've developed something called honey or nectar guides. And if you look at these pictures, you can kind of see these striations and dots. And you should think of these a little bit like the markings you see on a runway at an airport. They're basically telling the insect pollinator or the bee where to land and where to taxi and where to go for the floral reward, which would be the pollen or the nectar. And the flowers are pretty clever because in guiding these bees to the floral reward, they're making sure the bees pass the anther where the pollen is, and then also the stigma where they will then be fertilized. So here's a few examples of some flowers we know that you can see the honey or nectar guides with your own eyes, but believe it or not, most of these honey or nectar guides are invisible to our eyes. Next slide. So here I have some pictures taken of, all of them are regular yellow flowers, and then they're taken with a UV filter so that you can see the UV markings on the flowers. So it turns out that most honey and nectar guides on flowers are UV. So we aren't able to see them at all, but the bees can see them very clearly. And these pictures show you a little bit like what the bee would see as opposed to what we see. And that's because we see on the blue side of the color spectrum, and bees see, we see on the red side of the color spectrum, and bees see on the blue side of the color spectrum, including UV, which we don't. So next slide. I don't know if this is engaged and working. Oh, there it is, good. So this is sort of just a little graphic example, like when a bee sees what we see, it sees nothing, but because they're able to see UV, they see this kind of comic strip of a beekeeper who's smoking himself, and they see the honey and nectar guides on the flowers. So next slide. Oh, okay. So another way that flowers have evolved to help bees out is something called thermogenesis. And what thermogenesis is when a flower is able to increase its temperature above the air temperature around it. And the reason flowers do this is to increase the volatilization of scent. It's to make its smells stand out amongst the other flowers nearby. And so the way they do this is by mitochondrial release during respiration. It's a sort of secondary aspect of respiration. And again, the reason flowers do this is because they're trying to make sure that the bees will have a nice user experience and come over and pollinate them. Their whole thing is to get pollinators to come, to have a good time, and to return again. Next slide. So another interesting thing that happens between bees and flowers is the way they use electricity. So when a bee is flying through the air, it's losing electrons. And what happens when it loses electrons is it builds up a positive charge. And then the flower, which is planted in the ground, has a very weak, grounded negative charge. So two things happen when a bee who's positively charged lands on a flower that has this negative charge. And think of it a little bit like when you rub a balloon on your head. you're kind of knocking electrons off one thing, so it's creating this extra strong attraction between the two. So when the bee lands on the flower and it's all positively charged, the pollen on the anthers and stamen comes off and just kind of clings to the bee like static electricity clinging. And that helps the bee so that when it's doing its little trip past the stigma, some of that pollen will get stuck on the stigma and pollination will occur. Another interesting thing that happens is that while the bee is visiting the flower, during that time, the weak negative charge is taken over by a stronger positive charge that the bee is leaving. And so when another bee comes along, instead of feeling a negative charged flower, it's going to feel another positive charge. And if you remember when you were a kid and you played with two magnets, if you tried to put two positively charged magnets together, they kind of pushed each other off or pushed each other away. And this is one of the ways that a bee knows that a bee has just been at that flower, so the nectar glands are probably empty for the time being, and not to bother wasting your energy to stopping. Bees also will leave a little bit of a scent on a scent marker on a flower. That is another way that the bee knows that it's been recently visited and not to waste your time there. Okay, next slide. Maybe Joe talked a little bit about this in the tomato talk. I think Joe was before me, but certain plants, in fact, 9% of the plants need a very specialized kind of pollination that only certain bees can do, and mostly they're bumblebees. And this is called buzz pollination. And this happens because the pollen on these plants that you see here, including the tomato, the potato, the cranberry, the manzanita, blueberry, eggplant, the pollen is not on the outside of the anther, but it's packed inside the anther. And so the only way to get that pollen out is to give it a good shake, because there's one hole at the end, and that is something called sonication or buzz pollination. And basically what the bumblebees do is they latch on to the flower and they engage their wing muscles, but they don't actually move their wings. They've detached their wings from the muscle, and they start vibrating. And that vibrating comes to a middle C range for you musicians. And that's exactly the vibrational energy needed to get the pollen to be released from these specific plants. So thank God we have these bumblebees. That's how come we have so many tomatoes and blueberries. Okay, next slide. And yet another thing that's interesting that's evolved on flowers that have helped the bees is something called the papillate conical cell. And what these are is a kind of a mechanical aid for bees that helps them to land on flower petals. And if you think about it, flowers aren't always just sort of laying flat and unmoving. They're often hanging upside down, or they're blowing in the wind. And so in order to make the bee have a landing that sticks, they grow these kind of little bumps, almost like little Velcro-y bumps that the bee can kind of cling on to when it lands on a flower. And at first they weren't certain what the function of these were. They thought perhaps it helped with the UV, it helped with temperature regulation, but there's two experiments that made it pretty clear what these papillate conical cells do. And one was they found these mutant snapdragons, and the mutation in the snapdragon was that they didn't have papillate conical cells. And they were mixed in a field with regular snapdragons that did have the papillate conical cells. And they observed the native bee visitation of these snapdragons. And what they saw was that if the snapdragon did not have any papillate conical cells, the bees would not visit them. I'm just going to check chats to see if people have a question for me. No. Okay. And so the other experiment was that they had a lotus in the Micronesian islands that was bee pollinated most of its history. And then that native bee went extinct, and it became a bird pollinated flower, this lotus. And what they observed was that during that transition, the flowers start producing the papillate conical cells. So when the bees stopped being the primary pollinator of these lotus flowers, they stopped producing these papillate conical cells when the birds became the primary pollinator. Okay, next slide. So I've told you a little bit about flowers and bees and how they've kind of co-evolved, but now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the different kinds of pollen foraging that bees have. So again, like I said at the start, I think a lot of us, when we think of bees, we think of honeybees because we have this relationship with them, but honeybees are just a small portion of the bee population. More than 90% of the bees are these native solitary bees. And I'm very proud of these pictures because I just took them last week on my pear tree, and these are my bees visiting my pear tree, and they are honeybees. So we have 3 types of bee pollen foraging. The rarest type is called monogalactic bees, and as you can probably tell from the monogalactic bees, while very rare, they only pollinate one flower, only one kind of flower in the entire world. And these bees basically have evolved with this flower, and it's a mutualism that's rare, but also particularly fragile, because without one, the other won't survive. So if the bee disappears, the flower won't survive. And if the flower disappears, the bee won't survive. So that's the monogalactic bee. Then the second category we have are called oleogalactic bee. And oleogalactic are the second part of the specialist bee, and they've co-evolved with a particular group of plants. And I'm going to show you one before, but they basically are specialized to a particular group of plants, say squash and gourds. That's the example I'll show you a little bit later. Then the vast majority of bees, honeybees, bumblebees, mason bees, are what we call generalist bees. And they are polygalactic. And these bees can basically pollinate any kind of flower. They can go from one kind to another. They don't need a specific flower. They don't need a specific group of flowers. They can go to all kinds of plants and flowers. Can I talk a little bit about, sorry. Yes, I'm going to do that now. That's floral constancy. And that's the fidelity you're talking about. Thanks for the question, Jeff. So obviously with monogalactic bees, they go to one particular flower. So pollination occurs because of that. And then with, oh, sorry. Hold on, I have another question here. Yes, so specific, there's one in California, and its name I don't have with me, but we have one, there's 2 I can tell you about. There's one in Virginia that's co-evolved with a native Virginia plant. And then we have one in the question, sorry, I'm not used to doing this on Zoom. The question, since you didn't hear it, is can I give an example of a monogalactic bee? And we do have one monogalactic bee in California, in Northern California, that pollinates a coastal flower. I can't remember the name of the flower or the plant, but basically it's a very short lifespan. The bee lives for about 4 to 6 weeks, and that's about the time that flower is in bloom. And then there is and then like I said, there's also one in Virginia whose name I can't think of yet. And then, sorry, I forgot the species, the bee in Texas. Yeah, so that would be, Jeff just gave another example. Again, he doesn't know the species, but there's a bee in Texas that pollinates only one species of passion fruit. So these mutualisms are super rare, but they do exist out there, that there are bees that live only for one flower. And because of that, that flower gets pollinated. And usually because there's some specialized development in the bee that's specific to that flower. And when I talk about a specialist bee a little bit later, you'll see that. The other question that Jeff had that I was going to talk about is what we call floral constancy. And floral constancy means that even though you could be a generalist bee that could go to any kind of flower you want, you don't do that. When you go out on a foraging trip, you only go to one flower. And the reason this happens has to do with the way anybody's memory is formed. A bee, like us, has a long-term memory and a short-term memory. And in a bee's long-term memory, they can remember where their hive is, they remember where stands of flowers are, etc. But in their short-term memory, which only lasts for a few minutes, that's where they remember the structure of a flower. So when he goes out, the bee might not be specifically looking for one type of flower, but whatever that first flower the bee visits is, that's the structure they'll remember, and that's what they'll be looking for their other visits on that trip. And if you think about it, if it didn't work that way, pollination wouldn't occur. So if you went from a cucumber flower to, you know, a lavender, that would not have a lavender pollination. But because of this floral constancy, when a bee keeps going to the same kind of flower, then pollination occurs because the right pollen is going to the right place. So let me just make sure I got all the questions there. All right, thank you for the good questions, everyone. All right, next slide. So I was talking a little bit about these specialist bees. So this is a squash bee. And so a squash bee is an example of an oliglectic bee. So it'll go to more than one kind of flower, but it only goes to one species of flowers. So in this case, it's squash and gourds. And the reason this bee has evolved to be the bee for squash and gourds is a couple of things. First, it has unbranched hairs. So it turns out, I don't know if you've ever had to pollinate your own zucchini, but the pollen grains for squash and for gourds is really large. It's very big in the pollen world. So these bees have these unbranched, sparsely placed hairs that allow that kind of big pollen to adhere to its body. The second evolutionary thing that they have is, if you remember when I was talking about the anatomy at the beginning, I was talking about these simple eyes called these ocelli, which don't make pictures, but they're basically allow bees to see, to take in light differences. Well, as you probably have noticed in your own garden, squash flowers are in their prime really early in the morning, like at night practically. And most bees don't come out at night. They wait until the sun is really warm. But squash bees do come out at the night. They can come out at dusk when it's still pretty dark out. And the reason they're able to do that is because they have these large ocelli that really allow them to see in the dark, basically. And of course, that's when squash and gourd flowers are at their prime. So that's why this bee is a special bee for squash plants. And if you're not having good luck with your zucchini, chances are it's because you have no squash bees in your garden. And so you might have to do what I do and use a Q-tip to make that pollination happen. Okay, next slide. So as I was mentioning, we all call it pollen, but pollen is not the same. It's chemically very different from plant to plant. And as you can see in this kind of enlargement here, it comes in different shapes and sizes. And I have this chart here that shows some of the very different colors that pollen come in. And if you're a beekeeper, if you ever just spend a little time watching the bees come in, you'll see in those pollen baskets or the corbicula on the sides of their legs I was talking about, they'll be coming in with different colors. I mean, admittedly, a lot of it is in the yellow range, but when they get on the echium and stuff and they come in with these bright purple loads of pollen, it's just very cool to see all the different colors they get. So I wanted to tell you about one Swiss scientist who basically did an experiment to see what would happen if you took a generalist bee, and these are the bees I was telling you about that can go to many different plants. In his case, he took 2 different kinds of mason bees, which are generalist bees, and he fed them only one kind of pollen. And he did this for 4 different kinds of plants. And what he found out was kind of interesting, because he found out that for some of that pollen, it worked for the mason bee. They were able to raise their brood and they were able to survive and be healthy. But some of the pollen, if he only fed it one type, turned out to be toxic for the mason bee. But what was really strange is that the pollen that was toxic for one type of mason bee was perfectly fine for another type of mason bee. So the gist of the story, and it's kind of complicated if I told you all the names of the plants and everything, is that not all pollen is the same, and not all bees can survive on just one type of pollen, especially if they're generalist bees. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about making honey, because this is kind of an interesting, maybe a little bit gross process. So when a bee is going out foraging, it takes in nectar for 2 reasons. One reason it takes in nectar is for its sugar water. It takes it for its own energy to do its job and go out foraging. It's basically, once the bee is fully grown, its only source of nourishment is nectar. And then it takes that into its regular stomach and uses it to create energy for itself. But it also takes in nectar into a separate stomach called a honey crop or a honey stomach. And this stomach is one that basically is used to start the process of making honey. So what happens is the nectar gets into this honey stomach, and it has some enzymes in there that will change the pH of the nectar, and it'll break down the sugar. So it basically goes from a glucose, and it gets broken down into sucrose and fructose. And the other thing that happens is that when you take in nectar, it's about 80% water. And by the time a bee does what these bees in this picture are doing, and they start laying the honey mixture into the comb, it's only 20% water. So it's basically dehydrating and breaking down the nectar in this honey stomach while it's out foraging. And then it'll get back to the hive, and it'll basically meet up with a worker bee, because I'll tell you a little bit about it later, but at different stages in a honeybee's life, it's doing different jobs. And in its pollination or foraging stage, it's mostly outdoors getting nectar and pollen. But when it gets back to the hive, the foraging bee will regurgitate the contents of its honey stomach or honey crop into the mouth of another bee, a worker bee, and that bee will take it into its honey stomach. And this process continues until it gets to that 20% solution. And then when it's at that 20% solution, the bees will put it down into the honeycomb, but it's not cured yet. They still then will do this kind of fanning motion, and they'll evaporate even more of the water out till they get it around 16% water. And it sort of crystallizes, and then it's real honey, and then it becomes capped. So capped honey is the kind that you and I eat. It's been fully cured, and it can last a really long time. One of the things I always find interesting is there's this lore of people feeling like if you eat honey that's from a specific place, that perhaps it will create some sort of immunity from allergies to the local plants. But as we just learned, there's really no pollen at all involved in honey making. It's only nectar. So I'm not sure if that theory is correct or not. All right, next slide. Okay, so like I said a moment ago, so remember I told you that story of my friend with the big olive grove? Well, here's the first hive. I did end up putting hives on his property, and he has this enormous spread that's completely organic, no pesticides, no nothing there. And I have never lost a hive up on that property. I have 3 up there, and I've never, ever lost a hive. So go organic. So I was talking to you a little bit earlier about the fact that we talk a lot about honeybees, but I wanted you to just recognize that the majority of bees are what we call native solitary bees. And they don't live in hives. They don't live with other bees. They are basically do their whole lifespan on their own once they've been fertilized. And of those bees, about 70% of them are ground nesters, and the other 30% are hollow nesters. So next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the life cycle of this solitary bee. So a solitary bee, which is our vast majority, live for about 1 year. And so they are basically dormant from fall through winter. And then in the late winter, early spring, they will emerge from their ground nest, and they will emerge at the same time as some drone or male bees, and they'll mate. And they'll mate a couple of times until they're basically full of sperm, and then that's it. They have all their sperm for the rest of their life, and they start basically going out and building their ground nest. And they usually, sometimes will take over a nest that has been abandoned by another bee, or sometimes they'll start on their own. They sometimes will share an entrance to a nest, but they always build their own nest. They're really, truly solitary. And they'll go around after they've made their nest, and they'll start provisioning that nest. And what they do is they sort of make something called bee bread, which is a combination of pollen and nectar. And they make little tufts of this pollen and nectar, and that's where they're going to lay their eggs. And they do this in late spring and early summer. They lay their eggs, and the eggs basically go through their process of being larvae and pupa, and then they grow into the adult size and they go dormant right away. So that's the lifestyle of the bee. And by that time, the bee's lived 1 year and it's dead, the original bee, but she's left a bunch of babies, and hopefully some of them will survive the birds and be able to reproduce again. Next slide. So the second type of bees I want to talk to you about are what we call semi-social bees. And these best example of these is the bumblebee. And a lot like the solitary bee, they live for a 1 year lifespan. What's a little bit different about these bees is that when they go into their dormancy in the winter, they've already mated. So these bees will grow into adulthood at the same time as the drones, and they'll go out and they'll have sex and they'll fill up with the sperm, and that will be the sperm for the rest of their life. The drones will then just die, but the female queens will go into a winter hibernation. And then when spring comes, she'll come out of hibernation and she'll be kind of weak and tired. So she'll go out foraging and get strong again. And she will, then start building a nest. And then she'll also make bee bread, which is the combination of pollen and nectar. And then she will basically lay these little tufts in her nest. And then she will incubate the first set of bees. So she will rear them herself. And then when those first set of bees emerge, they basically turn into workers. And so she then spends the rest of her life laying eggs, and the workers start doing the foraging and caring for the young. So she sort of starts life as a solitary bee and then sort of a little bit changes into like more of the lifestyle of a honeybee. But she'll do this throughout the summer, and she'll lay a couple of generations. And then by the late summer or fall, she will basically then decide to make her new queens, so not lay any more workers, and her new drones. And a bumblebee actually makes a tiny bit of honey, not at all like a honeybee, but she uses that honey as some of the food for her bee bread to make the queen. And I see I have a question here. Oh, I didn't know that. So Jeff is telling me that carpenter bees can live for many years and they just go dormant in the winter. I'll have to look that up. I wasn't aware that there were any solitary bees that lived more than a year. Very interesting. All right, I'm going to look that up. I have a real expert here. Okay, so next slide. So then the last one I wanted to tell you about are the social bees or the honeybees. And so there's basically 3 types of bees. Oh, Jeff and I are going to confirm this. I didn't know that. I mean, it's possible, but I didn't know there were any solitary bees that lasted more than a year. The only bee that I know who lasts more than a year is a queen honeybee. And in the olden days, she could live about 5 to 6 years. But nowadays, she lives more likely about 2 or 3 years. So in a beehive, they live a social lifestyle, and they have they have castes, and they have very specific jobs that they do. So the queen, like I told you, lives the longest. She lives intergenerationally. And then we have the drones, who are the male bees, and they have a pretty short life. It's an easy life. They don't have to do any work. They're fed, and their main job is to just sort of wait around until the new queens are produced. And at that time of year, they go out flying, and they hope to be the mate with the virgin queen. Because like the solitary and the semi-social bees, a queen honeybee only mates once in her life, and she may mate with multiple partners, but once her sperm collector is filled, that's it. She stops. She has the sperm for the rest of her life. And then the third type, aside from the drone and the queen, was the worker bees. And worker bees basically go through a couple of stages. In their early stages, they work inside the hive. At their youngest, they're basically polishing the honeycomb and getting it prepared for brood. They can make wax. They have all these, then they become nurses who actually take care of the brood. Then they can have the job of getting rid of dead bees. And then their last job they usually have is as guard bees. So they're down by the entrance to the hive, making sure nobody who's not part of the hive is coming in, because like wasps try to come in and all kinds of stuff. And then finally, in the last weeks of their life, they will go out and they will be foraging bees. So they'll be going out to collect honey and pollen. So, okay, Jeff has an answer to this question.
All right, let me just unmute quickly and I'll read what it says. It says the nesting habitat for carpenter bees are solitary and often long-lived. Males and females overwinter in groups.
Oh, funny they call them solitary.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Good. I'm glad. Well, next year's class will benefit from your wisdom there, because I didn't know that. And I'm surprised they call them solitary bees if they nest together. That's very interesting. Yeah. It's unusual.
It is.
So just to finish up with the honeybees, so in the winter time, a worker bee can live 4 to 6 months. And that's because their job over the winter is basically keeping the queen warm. They're basically like a big thermal blanket, and they just form this bee ball around the queen and they keep her fed. And that's their job for the winter. They don't go out foraging. They don't do anything like that. But in the very active spring and summer months, the honeybee can only live maybe 4 to 6 weeks. And so that's going to come up in a little bit later. Next slide.
Oops.
Okay, so one of the things I wanted to tell you about is a resource that we have here in the Bay Area. And if you've ever had a chance to see Dr. Gordon Franke speak or have his book, he's a super nice guy. He's all about the bees. And he's created over at the Oxford Street tract at UC Berkeley an urban bee garden. And he basically brings his students in there and they do all kinds of experiments. But the main goal of the urban bee garden was to see how we could attract pollinators to our garden. And he's come up with 3 kind of golden rules that will bring in the most bees to the garden. The first rule is to plant plants in big swaths. And by big swaths, he means something that is 3 feet around or 3 feet wide. And what they found in this garden was that you could have the same flower in smaller patches and it would be less visited by bees than in the bigger patches. And as we remember from earlier in our discussion, this makes a lot of sense when you consider that bees are practicing floral constancy. So they want to be collecting pollen and nectar from the same kind of plants. So if you have them in a big group, then that's the perfect setup for the bee. And as I was telling you, when I would see my bees, not in my garden, but outside my garden, I would see them on rosemary bushes, which had lots and lots of flowers of the same kind, or echium, which also those big spires that look like one big blue flower are hundreds of little flowers. So it's like nature. If you hike up in the Sierras, you see wildflowers in big, big groupings of the same kind of flower. So the second thing that Dr. Gordon Franke recommends if you want pollinators in your garden is to leave about half your garden bare. And by this, he means no hardscaping, no mulch, no weed cloth. And I know that's a tough one for us because we like our gardens to look just so, and we're in a drought, so we want to mulch. But if you remember, I told you 90% of the bees live in the ground. And if they don't have ground, they're not going to be hanging out in your garden at all. So that's his second golden rule, is to leave some bare ground. And that's pretty easy to do if you do it under your hedges and under trees where you shouldn't really have mulch up to the base of the tree anyway. Maybe you can't get to 50%, but as much bare ground as you can manage helps the bees a lot. And then the third golden rule is the rule of having food. And that means to have 15 to 20 flowering species in the spring and 15 to 20 flowering species in the summer. And so this is sort of along the lines of not all pollen is created the same. If you have a lot of variety in your garden, that'll bring in the generalist bees. And yes, Ellen's question is, can bees live in lawn grass, or does it need to be bare dirt? They can get through lawn to the dirt. And can I say the last one again? Number 3 is to have 15 flowering species, 15 to 20 flowering species in the spring and 15 to 20 flowering species in the summer. So you want a big variety of plants in bloom for the spring and summer when most bees are active. And Ellen's question was, can bees live in lawn grass, or does it need to be bare dirt? And they can get down to dirt through grass. And in fact, the USDA recently recommended that we not mow our lawns once a week for the sake of bees, that we do it every 2 to 3 weeks. So that's on point with your question. Hold on, another question. Yes, I have a signed copy of Frankie's book. He's great. If you don't have his book, Jeff is suggesting going to his book because he lists plants ideas in chapter 10 and 11, but you can just go on to his Urban Bee Gardens website. Just look up Gordon Frankie Urban Bee Garden, and he has lists of plants that do very well in the Bay Area that are very attractive to bee pollinators. Then Richard Ackley asks, is it difficult to identify local species of bee? How many species are known to be in Marin? I don't know Marin specifically, but we have a pretty diverse, landscape here. So I'd say a lot. I know in California, there's almost 3,500 varieties of bees. And I would recommend Gretchen LeBun's book on California bees. She's a professor. She lives here in Marin. And she's a professor at San Francisco State. And in fact, she came in and talked about bees when I was a student with you guys. But she did subsequent to doing that, she's done a book about California bees that might help you figure out the ones in Marin. I haven't seen a book that's specific to Marin, but that one is specific to California. All right. I think that's all the questions. Next slide. All right, now the depressing part of my thing. So in 2006, they identified a disorder going on amongst honeybees called colony collapse disorder. And the definition of colony collapse disorder is basically that all the worker bees leave the hive. They leave untended brood. Those are the babies that are still in the pupa or larva stage. They leave the queen, and they just kind of desert the colony. And I finally found a graph that shows, and I don't know if you can see it, I'm on a laptop, so I see it pretty large, but it shows from 2006 through last year, the amount of loss, and that's in the orange bar is the total annual losses in bees. And then you see in the yellow bar is the winter loss, and then what they consider the acceptable winter loss. Are those wasps? The bees are, oh, sorry. Hi, Arlene. Yes. So a lot of people, yes, exactly. Jeff's answering your question. So bees are vegetarian. A lot of Californians call yellow jackets meat bees, but they are not in the bee family at all. And it's really easy to tell the difference between a bee and a wasp, because wasps are black and yellow, true, but they're black and yellow on every part of their body. Bees are only black and yellow, if they are, because they can be completely black, on their abdomen. And that's the only place you'll see those striations. So as Jeff points out, bees are vegetarians, and they won't go after meat at all. Those are the yellow jackets. And I've probably told this story before, but when I first gave a talk about bees at the Marin County Fair, I only had like 20 minutes. And I said, well, if anyone has questions, you know, I'll be happy to answer, just, you know, wait for me at the end. And there was this long line of people. I was like, oh my gosh, people love to hear about bees. Every person asked me, how do I get rid of these bees? Every time we go out to eat, these bees come over and attack our food. And so basically it was all people with yellow jacket problems. And the answer to that is to just go to Marin Sonoma Vector Control District and tell them you have a wasp nest. Okay, so back to the colony collapse disorder. Yes, they do. But one thing to remember, wasps do get a bad reputation, but there are a lot of things that are pollinated by wasps, including figs. So we do need wasps as pollinators as well. So yes, a colony collapse disorder is when the bees, they basically leave a hive, and they will die, because without a hive, they're not just leaving. So there's two things you might be confusing. This is a question someone asked me about colony collapse disorder. Was this when the bees just leave? So bees do just leave when they swarm. And a swarm happens when every year a hive will basically make queen cells. And when those queen cells emerge, the new queens emerge, she'll take off with a group of worker bees, and she'll go establish a new colony somewhere else. So a swarm is something that's very natural in the beekeeping world. Beekeepers try to avoid it. They try to avoid it by splitting hives. In a way, bees try to stop it themselves, because typically the first queen to emerge will go and kill all the other queen cells before she leaves. And that's just, the nature of not having competition. But also when a bee queen gets older, or she's slow in laying eggs, they'll start making queen cells, the workers, and they're basically looking for what they call supersedure, where they're looking for a new young queen to take over from the young and failing queen. But colony collapse disorder doesn't involve the queen at all. The queen is left in her hive with the babies, but all the worker bees have disappeared. And I'll explain that a little bit later. We've just sort of figured out why that happens. And I get to that a little bit later in the thing, but for the basics of this is, how can you avoid colony collapse disorder? Well, we're going to talk about all the things that contribute to colony collapse disorder. And a lot of them are beyond our control. But perhaps in the future, there will be a way to avoid colony collapse disorder. But let's talk about some of the things that cause colony collapse disorder, because as it turns out, it's not one thing, but it's kind of a matrix of a lot of things that's happening. So next slide, please. So one of the important things to know about with beekeeping, with honeybees and colony collapse disorder, is to know about something called varroa mites. And their scientific name is Varroa destructor. And it's a perfect name for them because they cause no end of havoc to bees. So when I first learned about Varroa mites, we were told that the Varroa mites were feeding on the hemolymph of bees. And the hemolymph is basically the bee's blood. But as it turns out, this young kid, who I think was 19 or 20 years old, really interesting story. He grew up on the inner city of Baltimore and was deathly afraid of insects. And so his parents said, you can't be afraid of insects. So they took him to the library, and they kept making him check out books on insects and read about insects. And when he grew up, he decided to become an entomologist at the University of Maryland. So his name is Samuel Ramsey. And when he was 19, before he was even a graduate of school, he was the one who discovered that varroa mites are not living on the hemolymph of blood, like all the scientists had said, but they're living on something called the fat body of the bee. And the fat body of the bee is basically this lipid mass that is made up of something called a glycolipoprotein. And so a glycolipoprotein, if you think about breaking that up, glyco is sugar, lipo is fat, and protein. So there's cells that basically have sugar, fat, and protein in them. And they are what are stored in the fat body of the bee. And the fat body of the bee is something that the bee uses. If you remember, I was telling you about the honeybees, how in the spring and summer, when they're really active, they only live 4 to 6 weeks. But then there comes a time when those workers have to live 4 to 6 months. And what is the difference? Well, the difference is those winter worker bees have developed these fat bodies. And the fat bodies are these glycolipoproteins that basically give them the energy and the longevity to live for these long months over the winter to take care of the queen. And as it so happens, most of this colony collapse, if you remember from the prior slide, happens in the winter time. And in the wintertime, that's when bees build up the fat body. So it makes complete sense that these varroa mites are, causing havoc in the hive in the wintertime when the bees have these fat bodies. So next slide. The other thing about the varroa mite is they turn out to be these vectors for all kinds of diseases that are indicative in colony collapse disorder. Wow, that's a pretty blurry slide. So one of the worst diseases they get is something called deformed wing virus. And as I said, the varroa mites spread this from bee to bee, and it's exactly what it sounds like. The bee grows up with deformed wings. So it means that the bee can do the work for the first 4 to 6 weeks of its life, all the internal hive work, but it can never go out and be a pollinator or a forager. And so it has like basically a half useful life. And if it's infected very early in its brood life, it can also have a deformed head and thorax. So it's a pretty brutal disease. So next slide. A secondary disease that's spread by varroa mites is called black queen virus. And essentially, it's a virus that drones and workers get. But what happens is it doesn't really have any effect on them, but it causes the queen larva, and this is a queen cell that I was telling you about, it causes the queen larva to basically turn yellow and then brown and then black. And she basically never develops into a queen. She just sort of rots in her queen cell. And this is also very indicative in colony collapse disorder. They find black queen virus a lot. Okay, next slide. Okay, the Israeli acute paralysis virus. I love it when a disease has a name that tells you exactly what it does. This is another virus that is possibly a vector of varroa mite. It's also can come through nosemia, which I'll talk about in a minute. And essentially, hold on, I have a question. Can you say a little bit about how mycelium is helping the bee immune system? Well, I'll talk about the mushrooms in a minute, because that's not quite proven yet, but it has some big hope. So the varroa mites are bringing this other disease called Israeli acute paralysis virus. And when the bee first gets it, it starts being very shivery, and then it basically is paralyzed and not useful after that. Next slide. So another varroa mite gift to the bees is something called Serratia marcescens strain Sicaria. And basically, this is a bacteria that causes sepsis. So as you know, a sepsis is basically an infection of the blood system. And what we found out from this is that it's really horrible, and that they find that almost all of the hives that have colony collapse disorder have this bacteria in it. And well, I'm trying to think if I should tell you about this now or later. Okay, just remember this disease, and I'm going to call it SS1 because it's easier. Next slide. So Nosema serene is a fungus. So it's essentially bee dysentery. It means that the bees basically can't take in any sort of nutrition. They basically just have the runs. And what happens are bees are very fastidious. And so the other worker bees will try to clean up this mess, and then they become infected, and it just goes on and on and on. And they have this dysentery. If you're a beekeeper and you see yellow smudges outside your hive, chances are you have nosema. And what's weird about nosema is that it's a fungus, and it turns out that bees that have been exposed to fungicides, so this happens a lot in commercial agriculture, are more susceptible to nosema. So even though it's a fungus, they become more susceptible to fungus when they're exposed to the fungicide. Okay, next slide. Okay, the zombie bees have nothing to do with mites, with the varroa mites at all, but this was discovered here in San Francisco, and it's a really kind of a creepy story. But a professor at San Francisco State kept noticing these dizzy bees on campus. And so he would take the bees and he would put them in a little vial and he would bring them home to his praying mantis. and he would feed them to them. And then one weekend, he forgot to bring the vial home. And when he came back into the office, the vial was full of these little brown flies. So what it turned out was happening and making these bees dizzy was there was a fly called Apococephalus borealis fly. And what she was doing was she was sticking her, and does still do, is stick her ovipositor into the abdomen of the bee and lays her eggs there. So then the bee basically acts like the incubator for her eggs. And as they turn into larvae, they start feeding on the muscles on the inside of a bee, and they sort of eat their way through the bee. And then as you can see in this picture, they kind of emerge from the dead bee. And why they call them zombie bees is, aside from acting dizzy and kind of just going around in circles, if you've ever seen this happen, like I told you, bees do not like to be out at night. But when my hives get this, I'll come home at night and I'll have left a night light on, and there'll be bees circling around. Or when I open my door at night, bees will come in to come to the light. It's sort of like they're like moths. And they think that the bees realize there's something wrong, and they're trying to get away from their hive so as not to infect the others. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about neonicotinoids, which I'm sure you've all heard about. These are systemic pesticides that are the most widely used pesticide in the world. And we probably all have plants in our garden that have been treated with neonicotinoids, because if you shop at all at Home Depot or Lowe's for plants, they treat all those plants when they're young plants with neonicotinoids. And the thing about this pesticide is you only have to treat the plant once. That's why they call it systemic. Every cell that then grows on that plant will have the neonicotinoid in it. So it'll have it in the pollen, it'll have it in all the new leaves, it'll have it in the nectar, and in fact, the ground you plant it in will have neonicotinoid in the soil. So if you pull out that plant, the soil probably has already got the neonicotinoid in it. So why is this dangerous for bees? One of the reasons it's dangerous is because it is like a nicotine, and bees become addicted to it. So when they find a flower that's been treated with neonicotinoids, they go back to that flower because they have that buzz like a cigarette smoker. They really like it. And it turned out that this particular pesticide has mostly what we call sublethal effects on the bees. So it doesn't kill them outright, but it has these effects on them that does ultimately end up in the death of the bee. So let me tell you about a few of them. There's quite a few. So one of the things that happens with neonicotinoids is it affects the bees' ability to, well, it affects their immunity. It affects their ability to forage. It affects their memory. Remember I was telling you a little bit about SS1 before, that bacteria, and I told you to remember that bacteria. So if a bee has been exposed to neonicotinoids, that bacteria will kill 9 out of 10 bees. If that bee has not been exposed to neonicotinoids, it has a 50-50 chance of living when it gets that bee sepsis. So it makes it incredibly susceptible to the SS1 bacteria I was telling you about earlier. It also makes them much more susceptible to nosemia. That's the dysentery I was telling you about. So neonicotinoids, like I said, there's this kind of matrix of things happening where there's these natural pathogens and parasites that have always existed. And because of some of the pesticides we're using now have made them much more susceptible. And this interplay is kind of what's leading to colony collapse disorder. So I want to tell you about a few studies about the neonicotinoids, because it doesn't only affect honeybees. So they just did an 18-year study in the UK on rapeseed fields. And I didn't know this, but rapeseed is what they use to make canola oil. And it's a big crop in England. And so they were studying the solitary native bee populations who were feeding on these rapeseed fields. And they found a 20% decline in the population over 18 years. So that's pretty bad. So I also wanted to tell you about, they did a really recent research study that came out like just a week ago that basically said when bumblebees were exposed to neonicotinoids as young bees, that it made their brains grow small, or their brains didn't fully develop as adults. And it was an impairment that would last the rest of their life. It basically makes their brains stop growing. So that's not so great. They found another study that it shortened the life of the male drone honeybees, and it reduced their sperm count by 39%. So neonicotinoids have a lot of bad effects on bees, and it also makes them susceptible to a lot of terrible diseases. So the next slide. So then when the bad news started coming out about the neonicotinoids, the agricultural industry started looking for an alternative, and they came out with something called sulfoxaflor. And sulfoxaflor was supposed to be the new pesticide that worked much better and was much better, but almost immediately they found out that this is really bad for bees as well. So in one study, they exposed bee colonies to sulfoxaflor, and they found out that the number of drones and new queens fell by 54%. So in 2015, the EPA decided that, okay, sulfoxaflor is no good, so they banned sulfoxaflor. But then they issued emergency use permits every year thereafter. And then in 2019, the EPA reversed itself, and they have made sulfoxaflor legal for use again. So this just happened last May. So this is not a good thing for bees at all. The reasoning of the EPA was that although they recognized the studies show that this is really bad for bees, that it left the residuals left quicker than the neonicotinoids, which can stay for years, so that they said ultimately in the long run it will be better for bees because it dissipates faster, but it already has its bad effect. The only country so far that has banned sulfoxaflor outright is France and Italy. Next slide. So glyphosate, this is a pretty surprising thing. So as you probably all know, glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup and Ranger. And we've recently found that it causes cancer in humans. But they did two studies, one at the University of Texas, Austin, and one at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. And they were basically trying to see if there was any effect. I think they were looking for cancer effects, but they wanted to see what happened with glyphosate and with bees. And what they found was a really kind of sad and interesting thing, is that glyphosate is designed to work on a certain enzyme that is found in plants. And what ends up happening is when bees are exposed to it, that same enzyme exists in the bee's biome, its gut bacteria and flora and fauna. And that's really kind of important to the immunity of a bee, as it is to humans. The biome is sort of a big regulator of our immunity. So they found that bees that were exposed to glyphosate were much less able to resist the SS1 and many other diseases that I've been telling you about. What's really interesting is that bee biome and human biome is very similar. And I don't know if they've done a study yet to see what the effect on us and our gut bacteria is with glyphosate, but it would be an interesting study. So I have a question. How long will be there? Okay, so same question is on. So it can be there a long time. Neonicotinoids can stay in the soil for 7 years. The best way to know if they have been sprayed with neonicotinoids is to ask when you're purchasing a plant. If you've gotten your plant from Home Depot or from Lowe's, you can be guaranteed it has been treated with neonicotinoids. It's because it's a way they can guarantee the plant will survive and that you'll be happy and that you'll come back to Lowe's and Home Depot. They are planning to stop using neonicotinoids at Home Depot, but it's a plan. First, they're starting with the succulents, and then they're going to move to the other plants, but it's going to happen over 7 years. So yes, buy organic, or, I mean, even Slope doesn't use them. I mean, there's a lot of places, but just ask. You say, which plants do you have that have not been treated with neonicotinoids? Annie's certainly does not use any neonicotinoids on their plant. They're completely organic. Yes, they'll know. They'll know, and they're used to having the question come to them. The question is, will local nurseries know? They will know. And you often see, I mean, when neonicotinoids were first used at the Home Depot, you would see this little sticker with a smiling flower. And it was basically saying, I've been treated with neonicotinoids, nothing will happen. And yes, as Linda points out, the more you ask, it puts more pressure on buyers. The other question earlier was, how do you get it out of the soil? You can't. Compost and watering, it basically will dissipate and evaporate over time. But the example I gave is, say you put in a plant from Home Depot and you're like, oh my God, what did I do? And you pull it out and you go to Annie's and stick a plant in the same spot, chances are that plant will absorb the neonicotinoids from the soil and then will have it in that plant as well. Yes, well, fortunately my town doesn't use any weed killer, but if there are towns in Marin that still do, they're behind the ball, so you should ask. So the question is, I find dead bees in my yard, deck, driveway, and I don't know why. Is there a simple way to deduce what could be happening? That's an interesting question because, and it's not near a beehive, they're just dead by your yard, okay. Yes, well, typically they don't leave to die naturally. Jeff said maybe honeybees leave a colony to die naturally. Usually if they're out foraging, they get eaten by a bird, or if they die out, a bird will eat them. You do sometimes find dead bees in front of a beehive that have been kicked out because they have died naturally at home. The fact that they're on your driveway and deck, I don't know what that could be, unless someone nearby is using pesticides, which would be my first guess. And if you're not using them, perhaps a neighbor. My neighbor once a year treats her oak trees with something because she doesn't want those spider webs. And I find a lot of dead bees around my yard after that. Emery, you had a question, which was, does it mean that you should pull out any plants originally sourced at Home Depot? Well, I know, Emery, that you have a beehive. So yes, you should if you can. It'll take some time, but if you use compost and water the hole a lot, it'll help dissipate the neonicotinoids, but your bees are getting them. And here, I didn't even tell you this fact. I forget what school did a study on neonicotinoids in honey. They found that worldwide, there was 75% of the honey had neonicotinoid in it. And in America, 86% of our honey produced in America has neonicotinoids in the honey. So it's that it's going from the nectar, it's not only affecting the bees, but we're getting it if we're eating honey as well. So is that all the questions? Did I miss anyone's question? A lot came in at the same time. Looks like that's it. So the question is, will neonicotinoids make a colony collapse? It is a factor, Isabel, because neonicotinoid exposure makes the bees more susceptible to nosemia, which is a factor. It makes it more susceptible to Israeli acute virus, which is it basically, neonicotinoids weaken a bee in two ways. It makes them less efficient foragers because they can't really remember things the way they used to do. It makes them less able to reproduce because it diminishes their sperm count and the lifespan of the males. And it makes them susceptible to the diseases I was just telling you about. So yes, all in all, neonicotinoids are a big factor in colony collapse disorder. It's not that alone, it's that in play with those pathogens and parasites I was telling you about. Yes, I think the way of the world, I mean, most of the world, I think Canada and America are the only, oh, I didn't even tell you, they just banned 12 neonicotinoid products in America. There's still 47 that are allowed, but 12 have just been literally in the last couple months, they took them off. And what happens with these products is that they are negotiating the EPA with companies. And so when they, when they can get a company who has a line of neonicotinoid products to stop, they're doing that as opposed to just doing a big ban. Like in Europe, they put a halt to their use, and then they put an overall ban. For some reason in America, we're not just doing the outright ban. I think that's because there's no alternatives. They thought the sulfoxaflor would be an alternative, but it's not every farmer's choice to be organic, and that's sort of the only alternative at this point, is to be organic. And that's a whole different ball of wax as far as profits go, and as far as certifying your farm goes. And even if you have used pesticides, it takes many years before you can be declared organic, because a lot of these pesticides, like I said, go into the soil. Roxanne asked the question, is there a way to prevent varroa mites? Roxanne, bees have always had varroa mites. It's part of bee lifestyle. There's really no way to prevent them. What we've done is we've made bees much more susceptible to varroa mites. One thing I have heard is that with beekeepers now, we use these kind of frames that have it has a guide on that. It sort of tells the bee what size honeycomb to make. And we want a honeycomb that's standardized, and it's a big size to hold a lot of honey. But if you do a frame that doesn't have a guide in it, if it just has wire in it, they make a tighter honeycomb, and that helps knock mites off when they're going in and out of the comb. Sorry. So then the other question is, so there is some experimentation going on with the mycelium and with mushrooms, essential oils. There's a lot of different things out there. There's even some kind of computery science things that they're working on. There's a lot of people working on ways to get rid of the mites. There are ways to treat bees with miticides, for sure. And there are a lot of people who do that. And most commercial beekeepers do use miticides, but that only kind of mitigates the problem a little bit. It doesn't eliminate it at all, because we still have huge colony collapse disorder. So there is no way to completely get rid of mites, I guess the bottom line of it. What we need to do is have stronger bees who can put up with that infection. I had one more slide, I think. So one of the other issues that is part of the colony collapse disorder issue is that a lot of these honeybees that are dying in the winter are owned by commercial honey keepers. And what they do is they go around to different agricultural areas, and they rent out their bees for pollination purposes. But as we sort of saw in that earlier study, if a bee who's a generalist bee like a honeybee is really asked to eat just one type of pollen for months or weeks at a time, it's not so good for their health. So the industrial corporate farming culture we have in the United States is also contributing to the colony collapse disorder and to the dishealth of bees. I mean, some interesting facts about land use. In Europe, since World War II, 97% of the grasslands have disappeared. And grasslands, although they're called grasslands, had lots of native flowers and things that bees would live on. So that's really impacted the bees in Europe. And in fact, they did a study in the Netherlands where the bees, since World War II, have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller because of the resources. And it's interesting because in that same period of time since World War II, Dutch men have gotten 10% taller. So they're making more food and getting taller, but there's less food for bees. England has a really interesting program now where their farms are much smaller than ours. They don't have the big industrial agriculture we have, but they pay farmers to plant hedgerows of wildflowers around their farm. And when a farm is fallow, they pay them to grow wildflowers as well. So someone asked a question. So yes, so Jeff is very knowledgeable. If you guys have any questions after this, someone was asking the size of the honeybee colony. At its height in the summer and spring, it's about 50,000. Worker bees are always all bees are really female except for the drone, and they're only around for a short time for fertilizing. So a honeybee can travel up to 2 miles. They won't typically. They stay much closer. If they go somewhere like 2 miles, it's usually on an early her virgin voyage, as they say. The queen tries to go far away from her colony to mate, and that is just a function of having stronger genetics, of finding someone who's not related to her, basically. Yeah, and exactly right. Bees will go, that's why I said about keeping ground. Bees want to go, they're not lazy as much as they're very efficient. And so they really want to build their nest close to a place where they can get the food they need. And they want to go very quickly to get food and come back to their house. Julie asked, how is comb made? So when a bee is young, a worker bee is young, it has a wax gland, and it basically excretes the wax. And then they work it with their mandible they kind of knead it a little bit and turn it into wax. Okay. Any other questions? I think I'm going over my time a little bit.
No, you're not.
Okay.
You can take as much time as you need, James.
Okay. Any other? Oh, yeah. It is amazing, and I feel terrible every time I harvest my because it takes a lot. There, Jeff, with the facts. 9 pounds of honey make a pound of wax. So you think about how much work it is for them to make wax, and then as a beekeeper, you kind of have to pull it apart to get the honey. But I always put my, in one season, I don't do it from season to season, I'll put my torn up frames back into the hive, and they'll fix them and make them work again. So that's helpful, I think. And here's another good fact from Jeff. So one worker makes about 1/8 of a teaspoon of finished honey in her life. So that's a lot of work to get. I'll just show you my. So I have a big mason jar here, and my 2 hives in Belvedere, I probably got about 20 of these from my last year. So that's a lot of honey, and I use it all, or I give it away. Propolis. So propolis its purpose is it's sort of at least in my hive, what they use the propolis mostly for is they fill in gaps with it. They sort of like we make our hives with these little boxes, and they kind of like they're trying to keep the internal temperature of their hive at a perfect 94 degrees or something for the queen. I forget exactly what it is. And they use that propolis to seal off any air gaps or holes. Like even the hive reducer, they'll kind of cement that in place with the propolis. It's sort of like at least in my hive, they use it to sort of just make it more secure and airtight in there and rain tight. And Jeff points out they use it also to entomb intruders who they can't carry out and prevent the corpse from rotting. Because it has, I believe, some antibiotic or antibacterial properties. So yeah. Antifungal too, yeah. It's pretty amazing. They're very amazing things, and I hope you all will have the chance to find a friend who is a beekeeper and go into the hive with them, because when you're suited up, you're completely safe, and it's absolutely fascinating to go in. Any other questions?
If not, James, thank you very much.
Thank you all, and congratulations on, this is perhaps the first Master Gardener remote training class that there ever has been, and I'm really proud of all you guys for sticking with it, and I wish you all well, and I hope to see you at graduation.
All right, James, thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.